Oh, all right, very good. Good. Oh, all right, very good.
Harry, did you want to share your slides?
Yep, I will go ahead and share my slides.
Yeah, we're gonna get going. You should get your slides up.
Looking good?
Yeah, it looks good.
Nice.
Okay. Yeah, good. Okay, so let's get started. Welcome everyone. This is before we get going, let's mention this is our last seminar of the spring. We'll be taking the summer off. I think everybody's got things are starting to get back into the swing of things. Everybody's got lots to do. So we'll be taking the summer off and we'll see where we stand in the fall. So otherwise, we're happy today to have Harry and Gustavo is in the chat to talk about the employment consequences of anti-dumping tariffs. We go for an hour, Harry. If there are questions, everybody, the house rules, just unmute yourself and break in, and then we'll have time at the end for further questions and comments. Okay, so Harry, go ahead. You have an hour.
Cool. Thanks a lot, Kim, for the introduction, and it's great to be here. And thanks a lot for having me. My name is Haishi. You can call me Harry. I'm currently a postdoc at University of California, San Diego, and I'm joining the University of Hong Kong as an assistant professor this summer. I'm a co-author, Gustavo de Souza, who is also in the audience today. He's currently a postdoc at International Institute of Economic Studies in Stockholm, and he'll be joining the Chicago Fed this summer. So in recent years, there has been rising interest in among policymakers in using tariffs as an important policy instrument to increase domestic employment or to bring jobs back to the home country. So, for example, this is a quote by U.S. former President Donald Trump. Tariffs have put the United States in a very strong bargaining position with billions of dollars and jobs flowing into our country. And the Brazilian president, Jair Bolsonaro, also said, everybody wins from tariffs, especially Brazilian consumers. So given the policy interest, in this paper, we asked the following question. So what is the employment effect of import tariffs? So from a theoretical perspective, this should depend on the employment elasticities of winners and losers of such a tariff policy. And potential winners are the national producers that are protected by tariffs, as well as upstream suppliers that provide input to the protected firms. On the other hand, the losers from such a policy can be the downstream firms that use inputs from the protected sectors because they face higher input costs. So what we do in this paper is that we identify elasticities, these elasticities with microdata, and we use a macroeconomic trade model to compute counterfactuals in order to answer the question.
Hey, Harry, just for the macroeconomic stuff, I mean, I would have thought it'd been like with a model, it's straightforward. Tariffs are a tax on consumption goods, or a tax on goods. When we have high taxes on goods, that substitutes people into leisure. So, why is that not a force that you want to kind of be thinking about or talking about? That seems like the key thing.
It is. So like in this paper, we do consider like, a labor leisure choice and leisure consumption, substitution effect. We do have that channel in a model, but we would like to highlight here is the supply chain effects of tariffs, how they propagate upstream and downstream. And as you can see here, like the aggregate effect can be ambiguous. So we use a model to aggregate up these heterogeneous effects along the supply chain.
Okay, maybe it'll be clear. I mean, just the average effect, I would have thought you couldn't identify from any effects across industries, and you have to use the macro model, and then it seems like fairly straightforward. It's basically only the mechanism or the main mechanism is the one I talked about.
Yeah, maybe we can come back to this later in the talk.
All right.
Okay, so our identification strategy is difference in differences. the events that we investigate are anti-dumping investigations that are imposed by the Brazilian government. So dumping refers to the practice where a foreign exporter, say a Chinese steel exporter to Brazil, charges a lower price in the Brazilian market where they export to, compared to their home market, which is China. And the WTO allows national governments to impose, anti-dumping tariffs to correct for such, price differences. Okay, and during the summer period, there were a total of 576 investigations. 30% of them end up in no tariff changes, which we will take as the control group, and the rest we will take as the treatment group. And the identification strategy is difference in differences. And as I hinted before, the control group is the anti-dumping investigations that have no actions taken. On the other hand, the treatment group is the anti-dumping investigations that led to tariff increases. And we provide empirical evidence that supports that the treatment control groups on parallel trends if there were no treatment, and such a test is supported by institutional facts and pre-treatment trends tests. Okay, so this is what we find from the empirical section. So 100% increase in anti-dumping tariffs increases employment in the protected sector by 1.8%. And if you increase the tariffs on all inputs that a downstream firm faces by 100%, this will strongly decrease downstream employment by 4%. On the other hand, we find that anti-dumping tariffs do not significantly affect employment in the upstream sector. Okay, and we recover the aggregate effect from the model by aggregating the supply chain effects of tariffs. Okay, and the model is a small economy model of Brazil that takes into account international trade, sectoral input-output linkages, and upward sloping labor supply into individual sectors. And we base our model parameters on the estimates that recover from difference in differences. So here are our main quantitative results. First, we find that the Brazilian anti-dumping policy increased employment by 0.06%. So a small increase in aggregate employment, but this policy decreases, consumer welfare. And we find that the aggregate effect of sector level tariffs should depend on how upstream a sector is. So protecting a sector that is relatively downstream will lead to higher employment, will lead to higher aggregate employment gains compared to protecting a sector that is relatively upstream. Okay, and armed with the estimated model, we investigate if the Brazilian government would like to maximize domestic employment, what should their optimal tariff policy be? We find that such an optimal tariff policy for employment can increase employment moderately by up to 2.8%, but this substantially decrease consumer welfare. Okay, so our paper builds on the intersection between two strands of literature. The first literature is about the consequences of anti-dumping tariffs. So, for example, Kim had a paper on this, and there are recent papers that studies how anti-dumping tariffs affects, downstream employment. And the second literature that we build on is the literature that studies, the intersection between international trade and labor markets. And we contribute to these two literatures in three ways. First, we provide an identification strategy that exploits the institutional settings of anti-dumping investigations. And second, we quantify the aggregate effects of anti-dumping tariffs. We highlight the importance of input-output linkages for such, aggregate effects. as we take into account how tariffs affects employment in upstream, midstream, and downstream. Okay, and in the end, we study optimal tariffs that maximize employment with the estimated model. Okay. So the WTO requires that if national governments would like to impose, anti-dumping tariffs, they should follow the following procedure. The whole process starts with a domestic firm, say a Brazilian domestic steel producer, files a complaint against a product country pair. So, for example, steel exports from China. And upon receiving this complaint, the Brazilian government will judge if there is enough evidence that shows that the Brazilian steel sector is in decline, and such a decline is linked to import competition from, say, China. And if this is the case, the Brazilian government will open an investigation. They form a committee that looks into the case. And the committee collects, evidence. They look at, the price that the Chinese exporter charges in Brazil, in China. They do certain adjustments based on, trade costs and other margins of, normal values, what they call. And they determine if the Chinese exporter is indeed charging a lower price in Brazil than what they do in China. And if this is the case, the Brazilian government will impose a tariff, and the tariff will be set to exactly offset such a difference. And each tariff is set for 5 years, and after that it will be re-evaluated. Okay.
I have a question. So,
yes, please.
I mean, from the way anti-dumping duties are initiated by firms, I mean, this smells a lot more like protection for sale than any optimal tariff, in terms of trade arguments or profit shifting arguments that, government initiated. I decide that, I'm going to sort of decide the tariffs in accordance with where my comparative advantage lies in order to maximize country welfare. Whereas this, this is initiated by the firms. So, when we're thinking about the impact of these tariffs, I guess we should bear in mind that there's this political economy or sort of this type of dimension, which may be related to the concentration of the sectors or how politically connected they are. And then I start to wonder, is that something you're going to have in your model? And is that something that's important?
Yeah, I think this is definitely an important point, and that's why we take advantage of these, anti-dumping rules. So, in a nutshell, we constrain our sample to the investigated sectors and firms. We definitely recognize that this whole process starts with the firm that files a complaint. So the sectors that are investigated are definitely different from the sectors that are not investigated. But the whole point here is that conditional on investigation, whether a tariff should be imposed and the magnitude of such a tariff should only depend on what happens in a foreign country, what the Chinese exporter did, before, and we provide empirical, support for that. So the key takeaway from this slide is that conditional on investigation. Okay, the anti-dumping tariff is sort of exogenous to the underlying trends for the treatment group and the control group, and we will provide empirical support for that.
So Harry, a little bit to just understand your answer, the presumption is that the investigation is not politically tainted.
Can you say that again? The investigation is
not shaped by political economy issues, and it's not influenced by them.
I mean, the investigations are motivated by political.
The trigger to investigate,
but the tariffs
investigation itself is properly done is the underlying argument.
Exactly. So what I'm arguing here is that conditional on an investigation is opened, the tariffs are not politically triggered. they follow WTO rules, and we will provide empirical evidence for that. So our key identification strategy is a difference in differences. And first, we would like to highlight that we constrain our sample to only the investigated sectors and products. And this is exactly what Doran said before, that if we compare the products and sectors that are tariffed versus that are not tariffed, and this effect can be confounded by the impact of investigations, because the investigations are not random. The investigated products and sectors have a different underlying trends versus those that are not investigated. And investigations themselves can lead to trade policy uncertainty, as shown by previous works in this literature. And if we just simply compare the tariff products versus non-tariff products, these anti-dumping tariffs had to come after a anti-dumping investigation, and this can be a confounding factor in the identification strategy. And that's why we limit our sample to the investigated products. And the control group is the sectors with investigations formed but no measure taken. On the other hand, the treatment group is the sectors that both investigated and tariffed. And the key assumption here is that if there were no tariffs, the control group and the treatment group would have parallel trends that lead to the treatment, and that what this means is that anti-dumping tariffs should only depend on predetermined characteristics of sectors, whether this Chinese steel exporter engaged in dumping in the past. Okay, we provide the following empirical validation for this identification assumption. First, the WTO rule requires that anti-dumping tariffs are determined by past measures in a foreign country, and these past characteristics can be controlled for with country fixed effects as well as sector fixed effects. And we use event study figure to show that the treatment control groups have similar trends before the introduction of tariffs. We find empirical evidence that supports the anti-dumping institutions, which suggests that the Brazilian government is indeed following what is required by the WTO rules. Okay, what we find is that international prices, for example, what this Chinese steel exporter charges in a third country, say the United States market, and anti-dumping policy in a third country, say what the American government imposes on the same Chinese exporter, can explain the anti-dumping tariffs that the Brazilian government imposes on the same Chinese steel exporter. Okay, and this suggests that international prices and what's going on in a third country can explain anti-dumping tariffs. We further show that anti-dumping.
Sorry, Harry. It also seems to suggest an instrument.
Exactly.
So that's what you're going to do.
Yeah, right. We
Got
definitely use these international prices as an instrument, and that's a great point. We also show that anti-dumping tariffs do not significantly correlate with other policies in Brazil and the political connections of the sectors and firms that apply for protection. We consider federal loans, public procurements, or subsidized loans. Okay, and we also consider placebo tests. We match our sample to similar sectors that were not investigated. Okay, for example, for a sector in the treatment group, we match it to a fake treatment sector that has similar characteristics, but they are not investigated. Also, we play with the time of the tariffs to create fake anti-dumping investigations and tariffs, and we find that these fake tariffs do not correlate with employment consequences. This supports that the results we find are not driven by sector level characteristics and trends. Okay. So this is the main specification that we use to study how anti-dumping tariffs affect employment. So for example, the left-hand side variable can be the wage bill of firm I in sector S in year T, okay? And on the right-hand side, we got this dummy that takes value 1 if year T is Q years from the first, anti-dumping investigation on sector S. And this dummy, as well as the coefficient associated with it, beta, takes care of the trend that leads to the investigation. Okay.
Harry, are you only going to look at employment or other outcomes such as wages and revenue, PFB?
In this work, we mostly focus on the employment related outcomes. For example, wage bill, employment, and wages. And we also look at like how these tariffs affect imports and exports of firms. And I will show more like the data moments in the table that comes later. Okay. And this interaction term has the same dummy variable for anti-dumping investigation, and is interactive with tariffs on sector S, which captures the first anti-dumping tariff against sector S in year T. So in this event study design, we limit our sample to the first anti-dumping tariff to ensure that there's a clean trend that leads to the investigation. But in the regressions, we take into account all anti-dumping tariffs. Okay, so what this figure shows is that in 5 years after the beginning of an investigation, 100% increase in anti-dumping tariffs will lead to about 2% increase in the wage bill in the protected sector. And as you can see here, there's no pre-trend, which suggests that before an anti-dumping tariff was introduced, the treatment control groups, which are both investigated sectors, do not significantly differ from each other. Okay.
Sorry to interrupt you again.
No worries.
You may have said it, but are these anti-dumping tariffs something that the government imposed as temporary and then removed, or do they become permanent? What's the background there? So
each anti-dumping tariff will last for 5 years, and after that, there's a sunset clause which requires the national government should reevaluate such a tariff. That's why we only show the event study figure until year 5. Okay.
But it might be interesting to show what happens afterwards, right? If these effects persist, or they return to trend.
Exactly. I actually had this discussion with Kim a moment ago, like the dynamics effect of like the removal of tariff. That's something we will look at in future works. Okay.
Sorry. Go ahead.
No, I guess the first thing I would like to see is just what happens to sales, right? Like, I mean, is it, do these things have a big effect on reallocating sales to the domestic producers? And, like a 100% tariff is going to have a big effect on trade. Mm-hmm. And so I find this is actually kind of a small effect, isn't it? I mean, if we thought that that this should reallocate sales to the domestic guys, and then you need more workers, doesn't this seem like a really small effect?
I mean, this is wage bill. This is like employment. We actually find similar effect for the number of workers or employment.
No, but I mean, the whole idea of the tariffs was to basically substitute people to buying domestic stuff, right? Mm-hmm. And these tariffs, they sound like they're so big that they're almost prohibitive. Wouldn't I expect it to, given the elasticities we know in the data, wouldn't I expect it to have like a much bigger effect? I mean, is there some way of kind of connecting this with what we know about elasticities and
yeah, so there are actually two aspects of your question. So yeah. One is that, like why we are motivating this with employment rather than sales. So I think one of these motivations that governments, in particular, like the recent administrations, they impose tariffs is to increase domestic employment. That's why we are focusing on employment. But I think we can definitely look at sales. And the second part of the question is that why we find a small effect. And as I will show later, this small effect can be rationalized with a model. And the key mechanism at work here is that we got high final demand elasticity. So if you got like an increase in the cost of input, final consumers will strongly substitute the downstream sectors with the downstream sectors of the sectors that face a tariff to other sectors. And this strong decline in demand for midstream firms' output kind of like dampens dampens the magnitude to which midstream tariffs affect midstream employment. We will show that. We will build a model to rationalize this effect.
No, but there's another point here, though, that George has raised it, which is that it depends on the elasticity of substitution, but also the level, right? Brazil is relatively close. So if you change, taking to the extreme, if you change imports from 2% to 1%, that's not the case, but it wouldn't change that much the sales and employment of the domestic farm. So somehow you got to adjust for that so that we can interpret these numbers better.
Exactly. I think this is exactly why we need a model, right? Because like sectors, as you said, like were heterogeneous in terms of their levels of employment, and we build a model that takes into account all these elasticities and employment shares, etc. And the model can fully rationalize these. Maybe it's small, maybe it's big. It really depends where you stand. These elasticities.
Yeah, I think what Cecilia and I are both saying is there's probably like a pretty easy kind of, it's not even reduced form because the models are pretty direct about like, what should matter for this response is the openness and the elasticities, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you could run these regressions in that way where you're controlling for kind of how open the sector is. And then the results would make more sense. I mean, in some sense, like the ACR formula is all based on this kind of substitution that should be taking place, right?
Yeah. So, like as I said, like we are going to estimate all these elasticities with difference in difference estimates. I'll show you in a second. Maybe we can come back.
Sorry, one last point on this picture here. I mean, so you're looking at the wage bill. I think it might be nicer to show employment, but on this point that maybe the numbers are small. And this is a paper by Justin Pierce, looking at the response of U.S. manufacturing to anti-dumping. And his paper basically argues that the firms that are protected just take it all in higher prices, and they become less productive. It's like kind of revenue goes up, but sales don't go up by much. It's just they're just taking it all as higher prices. And I don't know, maybe just seeing this picture, I started to think, well, is this wage bill going up just because the workers are just extracting more of those rents without affecting employment at all? So I think you really should be showing us the employment picture and then sort of thinking about this possibility that these firms are just, they're not expanding, they're just taking it all in the form of higher prices.
Yeah, definitely. I think we have the employment figure in a paper, but somehow we don't show it here. Yeah, thanks a lot for the suggestion.
Can I ask a question, perhaps a suggestion? I was wondering whether you will give us some results on the employment effects on the sector where the tariff have been imposed. Because you're showing the aggregate, right? But wouldn't it be interesting to see what's the effect of employment in the sectors?
Yeah, I think this is Doran's question. We do have this figure in a paper, but somehow we don't show it here. I mean, in terms of magnitude, it's similar to the magnitude in wage bill. That's what we find.
Oh, it's the same? Yeah.
So like wage bill is wage times employment, right? We do it for both wage bill and employment. I think they're in the paper.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So next we look at how these effect of tariffs propagates along the supply chain. So to investigate the impact on downstream firms, we limit our sample to the main downstream sector to ensure that there's a clean definition of the control group. Okay, and for each sector S, we identify the downstream sector D, whose main input is produced in this midstream sector S. So basically, the downstream sector is the sector who spends the largest share of expenditure on midstream sector S. And we define this tariff exporter measure, which is the increase in expenditure costs at the downstream sector D from a tariff that is imposed in on the midstream sector S by taking the product of such an expenditure with the midstream tariff. And we implement the same difference in differences on downstream sectors. The treatment group is the main downstream of a sector that is both investigated and tariffed. And the control group is the main downstream sector of a sector that is investigated but not tariffed. So this is what we find for the downstream sector firms. So 100% increase in tariffs lead to about 10% decline in the wage bill in the downstream sector firms. Okay. I mean, we employ a similar specification to investigate employment at upstream sectors. And we find there's basically no significant impact on upstream sectors employment. Okay. And sorry,
Harry. Usually the indirect effects are smaller than the direct effects. So I'm surprised that the numbers for these downstream sectors are so much larger.
So there are 2 points to make here. So one is that so the way we interpret this downstream effect is that if we impose 100% tariffs on all inputs that the downstream firm faces, what would be the employment consequence in the downstream? So this is not directly comparable to the midstream employment effect. If you remember that, like the midstream employment effect is a consequence of imposing tariff on just one sector. Okay, that's the first thing. And the second thing is that midstream and downstream effects have different control groups, right? These are all relative effects to their respective control groups. Maybe this is a case like downstream sectors are relatively smaller than upstream sectors, right? So I mean, I don't think these two numbers are directly comparable, and that's why we need the model to aggregate things up. Okay. And we can use a similar specification to study the impact of tariffs on imports. We see that there's a strong decline in imports in the protected sector, like 100% increase in tariffs lead to 50% decline in imports. And we also find weak trade diversion effects of tariffs to different countries, which is shown in the left panel. Okay, so like the protected, the imports in the protected products from other countries only weakly increases, and the imports in similar products from the same country also weakly increases. This suggests that the trade elasticity that we identify with these difference in different specifications are relatively smaller compared to what is found in the literature, as I will discuss more later.
So I was a bit confused by your response to Cecilia on the magnitudes. So we can't compare the magnitudes of this downstream with the wage bill effect in the targeted sector. We can or we can't?
We cannot because they have different control groups.
Okay, I mean, it would be nice to have something that you can compare, because if, for example, we tell the Justin Pierce story where what happens is, I lobby for protection, I get protection. What do? Prices rise. I just take that. I don't produce anymore. I basically hire almost nobody, maybe 2% more. And then the guys who are sort of purchasing from me, they used to import. Now they're purchasing from me. I'm a small producer. The prices are high. They get screwed. And they see a big negative impact. Whereas me, I'm just sitting pretty on my rents. And for some reason, I'm just kind of a crappy firm. So I just don't take advantage of the fact that I have this protection to expand.
Yeah, but like I mean, in our paper, like we do find real real variable increase, like employment increase in the protected sector. I think this is different from Justin Pierce's work. And
That's
yeah,
the question about
I
the
think
magnitudes. I mean, it's kind of, they may increase, but 2% is not very big, maybe for the amount of the protection involved.
I mean, I can definitely try to argue, like, for example, like downstream effect is greater than the midstream effect in terms of magnitude, but still they have different control groups. I mean, if like this goes to the Wall Street Journal, maybe this like pretty catching like title, but like from a scientific perspective, I don't really think these two numbers are comparable. But we can talk more about this.
But it might also help to actually see the equations, because you said that this downstream equation, it's as if the firm was being hit by all its inputs.
Mm.
So
because we have
so
this
there you are
shares
weighing by the share.
Yeah, because we have this share interactive with midstream tariff as a way to introduce variations to downstream sectors. And as we have this expenditure share here, the right way to interpret the coefficient is what will happen if we impose 100% tariffs on all inputs. Okay.
And that's material inputs only. It's not the denominator doesn't have labor or capital.
That's true. That's true.
Yep. So the other point is that perhaps having a little trade model that these things would be based on, so you can take ACR. These regressions might really help, because so the basic regression, for example, in ACR, it's going to be multiplied by the original value. So you have that share that I was talking about, the share of imports actually matters for this. And I think the ACR formula would have those shares in them. So it depends on the elasticity, and which is what you're trying to estimate, and the shares. So actually writing down a very basic standard model would help interpret these magnitudes as well.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the comment. So like I evidently think more about it, but my feeling is that the ACR formula speaks to only like trade flows and welfare, and we are actually trying to fill in a gap here, which shows that like employment can also be affected by tariffs, and we provide the first estimates for their magnitudes. But I think this is a good point. I think more about it. So we show that our results are robust to a variety of other specifications. For example, we change combinations of fixed effect controls, and we run this regression on the these regressions on the sector level rather than firm sector level, and we do something similar. Like the literature, for example, Asmoglu, Otto Dan Hansen did, we regress a sector's employment on weighted average upstream, downstream tariffs, as well as midstream tariffs. Okay, and we still find similar results, and we can instrument, the anti-dumping tariff, as Cecilia suggested before, with the price that this exporter charges in a third country, and the anti-dumping policy that the third country imposes on the same exporter. Okay, and the result is still robust. And we run the same regression on the regional level. We find that exporters to a weighted average tariff that a region face with the base equals to the region's employment share can also increase employment in the protected region. Okay. So with the empirical estimates, we try to recover the aggregate effect with the model. We consider a small open economy model of Brazil, because involve these involve the regressions. I mean, for the sake of time, I'm not reporting it today, that the anti-dumping tariffs do not significantly affect foreign X tariff price, which supports the small open economy assumption. And the agents in this model are workers, firms, and government. And there are capital S production sectors and the outside sector where households do not work. Okay, and the government will tax households by imposing an income tax, set tariffs on imports, and provide income transfer from the working households to the non-working households. Okay, so here is the households problem. A representative household omega chooses which sector to work in, and their composite sector level consumption goods are conditional on sector choice S, and their labor supply to the sector in which they work in. And again, I would like to highlight that, S greater than 0 means that the household is working, and S equals 0 means that the household is not working. And the household maximize the product of a conditional utility, which is a function of consumption and leisure, sector amenity AS, as well as a free shade shock with shape parameter mu. Okay, and the conditional utility follows a GHH preference if the household chooses to work. And the conditional utility is a function of only consumption if is a function of consumption only if the household is not working. Okay, and the consumption bundle is a CS aggregate of sector level composite goods with elasticity of substitution theta. And this theta is a key elasticity that we will estimate by targeting the downstream employment effect, because it governs how final consumers substitute from the relatively more expensive protected sectors to to other sectors. And this is a key departure from other models that study supply chains, for example, Caleno and Perel. And on the budget constraint, a working household receives a labor income, whereas a non-working household receives this transfer B from the government. And the government imposes income tax delta on all households, and delta is a parameter that we calibrate to Brazilian data. And the assumption that all households face the same income tax is a way to avoid distortions of sector choice by government's fiscal policy to isolate the impact of tariffs. Okay, and household sector choice and the within sector labor leisure choice implies that sector level aggregate labor supply is increasing in a sector's real income, and labor supply elasticity is lambda. And this is this free shade elasticity of labor supply includes both the sector choice free shade parameter mu and the within sector labor supply, which is psi S. And if you shut down this within sector labor supply, this parameter will just reduce to the free shade sector choice. And we introduce this cross sector heterogeneity in labor supply to match to the heterogeneous labor supply elasticity that we found with the data. Okay, and in here, like WS denotes sector wage, and to get the sector level real income, we divide wage or social insurance and benefit with consumer price PC. And we got this A tilde here that summarizes all amenities and elasticities for each sector. Okay, and the sector S intermediate goods producer in Brazil. If you look at the subscript, country 0 denotes Brazil. It is it's a CES aggregate of labor and inputs from all sectors, and capital A denotes the TFP, and LS denotes the sector level employment, and elasticity of substitution across inputs is denoted with this perimeter row, and we will estimate this row perimeter by targeting the midstream employment effect. Okay. And to do international trade, Brazilian composite goods producer sources intermediate goods from both home and foreign countries with elasticity of substitution across countries sigma s, and this is like the trade elasticity that we will estimate by investigating how anti-dumping tariffs affect Brazilian imports. Okay, and in the sector level imports combine product level imports with elasticity of substitution zeta s, and here small l denotes a product line, and anti-dumping tariffs are imposed on products. Okay, and here small p denotes the foreign price, and t denotes the anti-dumping tariff rate. And we identify this elasticity of substitution across products by investigating how tariffs, anti-dumping tariffs affects product level imports with the difference in differences strategy. And the government budget constraint, transfers, income from the working household, transfers from abroad, as well as tariff revenue to the non-working household. Okay. So here is a slide that summarizes how we identify the model parameters. We estimate the trade elasticities by investigating how anti-dumping tariffs affect product and country level imports, and we estimate them for 6 broad sectors. We take into account like cross-sector variation. We estimate labor supply elasticity by studying, by tracing out the labor supply curve, where we use, anti-dumping tariff as an instrument for employment. And we estimate these 3 sets of elasticities outside the model, and we target the midstream employment effect with the elasticity of substitution across inputs, and we target the downstream employment effect with the elasticity of substitution across consumption. Okay, and this is what we got, like the elasticity of substitution across inputs is smaller than 1, which suggests that inputs are complements, and final goods are strong substitutes. Okay, and here's a table that summarizes how well the model matches the data. So column 1 shows
sorry, is that the elasticity of substitution across bundles of inputs of different sectors or across firms producing different inputs?
This row is for one firm, say a representative from
the downstream
like
firm.
Any sector as firm, right? Their
The
elasticity.
question is it the elasticity of substitution between varieties of inputs or between
inputs
and other sectors?
Yeah, between inputs from all sectors. So
is
like
between variety of inputs or between bundles of inputs?
Bundles of inputs.
Okay.
That's what we observe with Brazilian data.
Right, and then
sector
the
level,
elasticity of substitution. I guess what I'm trying to get at is, what do you need the elasticity of demand for the upstream farms to look like? Because if that elasticity is smaller than 1, then you got a problem, right, with pricing.
Yeah, we'll come to the upstream employment effect later in the next slide. But this is elasticity of substitution across sector level inputs that the firm uses. So column 1 here.
Sorry, I have maybe a very stupid and more basic question. I didn't see firms anywhere in the presentation of the model. These firms are not competitive. They're perfectly competitive. Well, what's the firms in this model?
Yeah, sorry, like I'm missing this. So like the market structure follows from calendar Tariff 2015, which is like a workhouse model that studies how these sectors, how shocks propagate across sectors. So all markets are competitive. That's what we assume. Okay, so column 1 is the moments in the data. Row 1 to row 6 are the employment effects that we identify with difference in differences, and row 7 to row 8 how tariffs affect firms, imports and exports. And note here that we have we identify positive coefficients on exports, but this is not significant. So we can only claim that tariffs only weakly affects midstream firms exports. And we do find a strong increase in midstream firm imports, which is much larger than the upstream employment effect. And this is suggesting that midstream firms are substituting more expensive domestic labor with less expensive foreign inputs. And we also consider a sector's employment elasticity with respect to average upstream, midstream, and downstream tariffs, as what as Mogulus and Quarters did. Okay, and in a baseline model, we target midstream and downstream employment, and we use all other moments, including the upstream employment, to test how well the model matches the data. And we find that the model matches upstream employment effects as well as other employment effects fairly well. Okay.
Are you matching the level of inputs, imported inputs?
The levels of imported inputs. Yes, that's
shares.
Yeah, the shares. We definitely do it. So we rewrite the model in changes, right? And once we do that, these shares show up in the system of equations that govern the equilibrium. Okay.
And those are exactly matched to
exactly.
the data. Okay.
Exactly. The only floating parameters are the finite demand elasticities and input elasticities. And
so, can I ask, like, I don't even understand how the economics of the model, like, so the tariff goes on, and then just talk through that. Tariff goes on, then what?
So like tariff, if the government imposes a tariff, right? So like in a midstream,
just talk through those guys.
Consumers substitutes from imports to domestic producers. Okay, this will make the domestic producers to expand and hire more labor, right? And on the downstream, as downstream,
and then so
firms,
but that's what I don't understand. So like, why isn't it, to hire more labor, don't we need to see wages start to go up a bunch?
we do observe increase in wage. So like if you
I see increase in wage bill and I see increase in employment, but I don't see increase in wages.
I mean, like the simple way to see it is just like subtract 1 from 4, right? Which
yeah, that looks small to me. Yeah, that looks small to me. That's my point.
I mean, this is why like we estimate labor supply elasticities by sector, right? And we do find the baseline model hits these moments fairly well. But I think we make a good point. Like we definitely investigate more like these labor supply elasticities. But you have
I mean, do you know
find
what
an increase in wage.
Are those like, what do those labor supply elasticities look like?
I mean, there's cross-sector variation. Let me show you. But I think
you don't need to like.
Yeah, I'm running out of time. But this is a figure. So like we make this estimation for broad sectors. So like it is upward sloping, which means that upstream sectors are more has higher labor supply elasticity compared to this downstream sectors, for example, service and automobile, right? And this is exactly what we find in a data moments, right? Like midstream employment elasticity is indeed larger than downstream labor supply elasticity, and I mean this is like the average, right? Average across sectors. So like the numbers do not exactly match. That's reasonable, but I think we got these patterns right. Did I get your question? Maybe I should.
Yeah, we'll keep talking. Like you finish up.
Yeah. So what I show in column 3 is if we re-estimate a model that does not have input-output linkages, we let the model to target midstream employment with the elasticity of substitution across final goods, and this model misses all alternative all other moments in the data. And in column 4, we show a baseline model with Cobb-Douglas production technology and consumption. And as you can see here, this model misses all upstream, midstream, and downstream employment effects. And this highlights the important role that these two elasticities in governing like how midstream, how tariffs affect employment along the supply chain. And I think this is related to George's comment early on. So if you do Cobb-Douglas, the model significantly overestimate the midstream employment effect because it takes away the downstream demand decline. Okay, so let me move on to the results. So 3 key results I would like to show you. One is that with the model we can study the aggregate effect of Brazilian anti-dumping policy. It weakly increases aggregate employment but decreases welfare. And in this figure, I show like if we hit if you hit like individual sectors in Brazil by 2%, 200% import tariff, what should the aggregate employment change look like? We impose 200% tariff on all sectors, sector by sector. Okay, and do find these aggregate employment effect of sector level tariffs is negatively associated with how upstream the sector is. And this is consistent with our story that protecting sectors that are relatively downstream will lead to higher aggregate employment effect because it has fewer sectors that are even downstream to it, and it will cause like less less negative employment effect in these even downstream sectors. Okay, and in the end, with the estimated model, we asked the following question: if the Brazilian government would like to choose tariffs to maximize employment, what should be the sector tariff that they set? Okay, and by the way, like although like I show here only the broad sectors, we do this simulation exercise on granular sectors. There are about like 300 sectors in Brazil, and we aggregate them to broad sectors to avoid figure cluttering. Okay, and this employment maximizing tariffs should have 2 features. One, the average tariff should be high, about 400%. This explains why in recent years governments have so strong incentives to increase tariffs all around the world. Okay, and this employment maximizing tariffs should also be negatively associated with sector upstreamness, how upstream a sector is. Like the government will find it rational to impose higher tariffs on downstream sectors to maximize employment. Okay, so what is the aggregate consequences of such optimal tariffs? We find that the optimal tariffs that maximize employment will lead to moderate about 3% employment gains in Brazil, but this strongly decreases consumer welfare. And all these exercises are relative to a counterfactual equilibrium where there's no tariff that is imposed. Okay, and this is a brief summary for the numerical results. We find that the Brazilian anti-dumping policy increased employment by 0.06%, very small effect, and it decreases welfare. And the aggregate effect of sector level tariffs should depend on how upstream a sector is. Okay, and if the Brazilian government chooses tariff optimally to maximize employment, this can increase employment by up to 2.8%, but this strongly decreases welfare. Okay, so basically this is what we got from this paper. We find that 100% increase in the midstream sector tariffs increases midstream employment by 1.8%. 100% increase in on all inputs that the downstream sector firm faces decreases their employment by 4%. And we use a model to aggregate the supply chain effects of tariffs. We find that aggregate employment increased by 0.06%. Okay, and these anti-dumping policy weakly increases employment but decreases consumer welfare. And we find that on average, protecting downstream sectors increases aggregate employment more than if it protects upstream sectors. Okay, and the government whose objective is to maximize employment will have strong incentives to increase tariffs, and especially so for downstream sectors. And these optimal tariff policy for employment moderately increases aggregate employment, but substantially reduces consumer welfare. So this is what we got today. Thanks a lot for coming to the talk, and I look forward to discussing this more with you. And you're very welcome to send me emails to have follow-up discussions. Thank you.
Okay, great. So let's open up the floor for discussions or comments. Go ahead and unmute yourself and jump in.
You probably mentioned it, but what period of time did you collect the data from Brazil for?
1996 to 2015.
Do you feel your model would apply to less developed countries?
Less what? I'm
less
sorry.
Developed economies.
Less developed economies. I mean, we should definitely reestimate the model, basing on empirical estimates from these other countries. But yeah, I think so. I don't see reason why this model cannot be applied to, for example, sub-African countries.
Countries where there's more of a policy incentive to encourage nascent industries or to protect certain commodities from domestic consumption by maximizing exporting them.
Yeah, I mean, so let me put it in this way. Like in real life, governments have different incentives to impose tariffs, but this is like not the focus of this paper. So this paper is to use a relatively clean identification strategy that takes away such incentives by the government to identify model parameters that allows us to simulate different policy scenarios. For example, the export promoting policies or like domestic industry protection policies that you suggest.
So I have a related question. It goes back to the discussion of, how these sectors where you see anti-dumping duties might be different. I mean, what are the types of sectors where we see this? How concentrated are they? And, in terms of external validity, you estimate some impact. Should I then say that this applies across the entire economy or not?
Yeah, so as you can see from this figure, this is like to show like the average tariff rate by two-digit sectors. As you can see, like the tariffs cover a variety of sectors in Brazil, ranging from machinery and electrical equipment to food, right? And we estimate, the elasticities by broad sectors. So for each broad sector, we allow for enough, tariff variations on the product and small sector level to identify these elasticities. I mean, they do cover a lot of sectors.
Okay, but
this is not in percentage. Sorry, Doreen.
No, it's okay. Go ahead.
I was just asking for the scale. I didn't mean to interrupt. Is this percentage or its actual level of tariffs, 150?
So 1.5 means the anti-dumping tariff rate in terms of ad valorem tariff is 150%.
So it's specific for a country and that in a very small subsector of each one of these sectors.
Yep. Yep, that's true.
I mean,
So that's sort of my question is these subsectors, what do they look like? I mean, are they super concentrated? How many firms are there? This picture that you show with the tariffs, it doesn't really help. It's like conditional on there being anti-dumping duties on some tiny subsector in this sector involving a particular sending country, which is likely to be China, and particular firms in China, because that's how these things apply, then these are the rates. But it doesn't tell you, does it give a sense of, the subsectors where we see these things, are they representative of the vast bulk of employment, or are they, I don't know, steel, super, concentrated, big fixed costs in the steel industry. You don't have many players compared to, I don't know, other types of industry where you've got a lot of players and it's relatively competitive. And if, most of the economy looks relatively competitive and you're extrapolating elasticities from very sort of concentrated oligopolistic sectors, then I don't know, that's my external validity concern.
Yeah, I think this is a good point. Like presenting more like summary statistics about like the sectors that are investigated, and tariffs. So I think your question goes is about like so you, like, if you identify like tariffs on the investigated sectors, like how representative are they in the whole economy? I think like we can present more summary statistics for that. And that's a good point.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on that. I mean, so why are these firms dumping to begin with? I mean, what's the, and how are they determining? I mean, these price differences seem extremely high.
Yeah, I mean that's what we observe in the data. So like yeah, I don't know. Maybe like they're trying to build up their market share, so like they can accumulate certain like human capital or like consumer base. I mean, like this is about like the pricing strategy that this foreign exporters are still producing in China takes. I mean, it's an interesting topic to investigate by itself, but it's not like a. I mean, like the identification strategy we take is exactly, to take away at this point. Like we sort of like we find a way to isolate the exporters' pricing behavior from what happens to the Brazilian market.
So in the U.S., when they calculate these fair values, they in some cases where the foreign firms don't provide information, they can sort of the domestic firm can basically make up the cost, which leads to these outrageously high margins. I mean, is that going on in Brazil as well?
Yeah, like I think that's all like WTO members do, right? They form a committee, they compute the normal value of a foreign product and compare it with what they charge in the domestic market. So yes, I think that's what they do in Brazil as well.
Can I also follow up in the previous two questions? I think the broader point is that before you jump into the model, we want to see if the magnitudes of these results are reasonable. So, we want to see what's the value added, what was the initial China share in these broad sectors, and then the cost of that, how much did it go up, how much did the imports go down, and the sales of the domestic firms, and then what does that imply, how do you relate that to the coefficients, and that's upstream, and then the downstream, it also has to jibe somehow, and we miss that altogether, and then mechanically you just go to the model without having persuaded us that, the impact of these things had reasonable magnitudes.
I mean, I don't know what do you think are the reasonable magnitudes. I mean, like I agree with you, like reporting some of these summary statistics can be helpful, but like related to the identification strategy. So I think like our identification strategy is robust to a bunch of robustness tests. So I mean, I don't know.
It's not just summary statistics. They're very back of the envelope calculations that you can do, right? The price of this object that was previously a share X went up by Y, and then their share went down, and the overall absorption went down by, Z. Go through the steps of this is what's happening at each stage, and that's for the sector that's directly impacted. This is for the downstream sector. This is for the upstream sector. Why do things water down in one and get magnified in the other? I don't know.
So you want me to show this like sector by sector, or like, I mean, we definitely show this aggregate estimate for for the
Maybe
average of
the
all sectors.
average, or there's something, right? It was George's question from the beginning on what's the sales, what's going on here, and then
Okay.
the Doreen's and Eric's.
Yeah. Gotcha. Yeah.
So I'll kind of try to go to like the macro for a second, which was, I mean, I think it's ambitious to try to say that trade policy has these effects on employment, and then to try to identify them off of these anti-dumping effects. I mean, in some sense, like, you know, we've seen like in the U.S. trade integration has gone from 5% or 3.5% in 1965 to 20%, right? And the E over L, I don't even know what it is right now, but I wouldn't say that there's like a really massive change. And so it's a little bit hard to kind of think about like why that kind of like those really big effects over long periods of time aren't the things that are kind of helping us to identify the aggregate effects of trade on employment, which seem like pretty much nothing. So is there a way of kind of connecting why like that approach, where we're kind of just looking at trade integration, employment rates, why your approach is better than that kind of more macro approach?
I mean, this is an interesting point. Like, I mean, so what we are proposing here is a relatively clean way to separate, trade policy shocks from other shocks that underlie the economy during the during this long horizon that you talk about. So like, and we investigate like sector level variations and how these impact of trade policies propagate through the supply chain. So I do see a contribution of this paper on this front, but I think it might be interesting to combine these two approaches, right? Because like we're suggesting, for example, like productivity progress and so on, like they have supply chain effects as well, right? So yeah.
And then I'll kind of chime in on another point, which is just like, in any kind of intertemporal optimizing model, the effect on employment is always going to be through, how long the tariff is going to be in place, and on top of like what sector it is. If it's, again, if it's just like you're gonna tax things for one period, then people are going to do some intertemporal substitution, and so in some sense it sort of screams for like having like a fully optimizing model with some bonds and like some intertemporal elasticities to kind of really quantify the results. You know what I mean?
Yes, I definitely get it. So like, I mean, the way to define it, I mean, is that like in the data, right? The individuals, like the households and firms, are making the same, intertemporal like decision, right, about like the employment that they, the labor they would like to supply to the market, and to what extent they are going to consume, etc. Right? And we build a model that match to this data. So presumably our model can capture the average effect, okay, of these tariffs that takes into account such intertemporal choice in the long run. I think this is the best we can do with a static model, and this is the best argument that I can make. I mean, I think Kim's paper studies like firm dynamics and tariff policy, and I think that can be a very interesting a baseline model to work with.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you like another reference. I mean, Carter Mix and I have a paper. We actually look at this.
You do? Oh, I didn't know. Sorry.
We don't look at the same thing that you're looking at, but we're looking at the fact that most tariff reforms are phased in, or if tariffs are phased out. So tariffs are going to fall in the future, and so that because that's going to lead, in any sort of intertemporal optimizing model, it's going to lead people to take vacation early on in the reform, and so you actually see from the GATT rounds that countries that were more exposed to these reforms, you see employment actually falling even when tariffs are going down, and then in the long run, employment kind of catches up, and so. Again, that would, if you had a static model, that would, and you didn't think about the future reforms, you wouldn't capture that at all. So I don't know. I would encourage you to kind of think a little bit more about the dynamic decisions and the duration of these things in a more macro framework.
Yeah, definitely.
So I'm going to go back to my kind of question. What I want to know, like, here's the big picture point. I mean, we can talk. I mean, you have some mechanism in your model, and then you're fitting that mechanism onto, the reduced form evidence. Like, is that exactly the mechanism? Like, where's the evidence that? Because you have the story. It's just through kind of static labor supply kind of stuff, and then the firm's labor demand shifts around. And I'm just wondering. Whereas like Dorian was talking about Justin Pierce's stuff, which sounds different. So that's what. Is there a way for you to provide more evidence about this is the channel through on the employment stuff? I mean, you don't need to do it now. I mean, but this is kind of the thing is getting at the core mechanism that's active in the data, and then aligning that mechanism with a model that mimics that.
Yeah, I think like looking at these imports by firms, is providing an evidence that shows that these firms are indeed substituting upstream employment with foreign inputs. I think this is like one of these evidence that you're driving at. Maybe like I can look at domestic input flows. I don't know if the data exists. I think this is what you mean, right? To look at like indeed there's like cross sector flows of goods that sort of like the kind of like that supports the supply and demand channel. That
something like that. I mean, I mean, I would have appreciated before this slide on page 24 to kind of just talk through about, here's a shock, passes through into labor demand, and then labor supply needs to respond. And then I have this complementarity, across products, and that's going to maybe amplify or dampen things in a particular way. And I think that would help the audience to kind of understand at least the mechanism on the model that you're thinking about.
Yep.
Hey Harry, can I build on like Mike's question? So like here one like critical assumption in your model is that like product markets are perfectly competitive, right? So like if we want to like think about like Justin Pierce's argument or like different arguments along the lines that like Mike was talking about or like Dorian was talking about. So can we think that like some of these effects are coming from the fact that these firms like get more market power after like these anti-dumping effects, and this has like important implications for their employments? Like, I think like you can think like along the lines that Mike was talking about. So I think you can think about like how the markups of these firms are like changing after these like tariffs, I guess.
So like I think the model is isomorphic to one with constant markups, right? And if you think about like variable markups, I'm not sure the data exists for Brazil, but we do find this real economy effects affecting like employment along the supply chain. So maybe the US is different, but in Brazil, this is not just like firms are adjusting their markups. Although like we said might make sense that variable markups might be a factor that's kind of like included in these employment changes. And from the data side, I don't think we can speak much about it.
Maybe the washing machine paper, which is like the case study paper about anti-dumping. I mean, that's kind of, it's sort of clear what happens there. Boom, 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 all of these tariffs. Suddenly you can't import a washing machine from anywhere in the US. And okay, yeah, I mean, now we all have to buy US made washing machines, but the price really went up, like really went up. And so that, anybody who's thinking about replacing their washer is now, I'll just let it go for another 5 years. So the employment effects in that very concentrated industry, and if those are the kinds of industries where anti-dumping duties are prevalent, I mean, where actions are taken, you're comparing the successful versus the unsuccessful actions, but presumably those two types of industries are sort of similar, and these kind of sort of oligopolistic environments just may not be representative. I mean, I think they're interesting, but I'm just not sure how representative they are.
Yeah, I mean, to be precise, like I think the main mechanism highlighted in this, washing machine paper is that, importers substitute, domestic, U.S. washing machines with foreign imported washing machines, right? And U.S. washing machines are more expensive than overseas washing machines, so they receive a price increase. So I think this is neoclassical China that we talk about in this paper as well. Right.
Yeah, but it's like, this is my first reaction when Hamid started talking about market power, is I go, oh, the firms should actually, you shouldn't see them expanding employment, kind of like they kind of, but then I started thinking about more, you look at this as, no, if they were competitive, you should have seen them getting far bigger.
Mhm.
So it's like, it's kind of like that interpretation about what that 0.184 exactly is. Like, I look at that number, I say that looks small, and I agree with everyone saying, like, well, I don't think we have any idea what that number actually, like, on the face of it means. And then, but then through the lens of the model, is it like, whether you think of if there's imperfect pass through or not, I think it changes your view on if that number is small or big. I'm not sure. I mean, this is something you could write down the model and just kind of work through the math a little bit.
Yeah.
Hi, Harry. Regarding this magnitude, I was wondering how much the choice of your control group plays a role here, because at least in the US, there's a lot of evidence that even if you get a non-affirmatively ruled case hit, there's some large treatment effects of that. And also this group is like very heterogeneous. There could be like out of the market, like settlements that are not, that cooperation things going between the foreign and domestic firms that might have large effects on employment too. And since you're differencing them out, you don't find really large effects. I don't know if you've looked at other control groups.
Yeah, so we limit our control group to those that rule negative N. So I know Armin, you are playing with this data too. So those that rule N, okay, they are in the control group. And for the foreign products that had price adjustments, for example, they reached a settlement with the Brazilian government. They raised their price to avoid anti-dumping tariffs. Okay, there's some exporters do that. If the Brazilian government is providing data on their price adjustment, they show up in the treatment group. Otherwise, they are not in sample. So this is the way we treat these investigations that are ruled neither affirmative or negative.
So you haven't tried to look at firms in the same like different level of aggregations, or you don't see higher levels of aggregations within, I don't know, textiles. You don't have sub industries of textiles that were treated and none, because these rulings are usually at like very disaggregate level, at product level. So you can.
So like on the level. Yeah, on the level aggregation, like we estimate these elasticities by broad sectors. I mean, that's the best we can do. Like if you go like further down, there's no like anti-dumping tariff variation that identify like smaller sector elasticities.
All right. Yeah.